So here's what happened 15,000 years before Christ, in a place we'd recognize today as the Carpathian Mountain region. This is the story of how one moment of desperation changed everything about how humans survived on this planet. Picture this: a young woman named Kira, maybe 20 winters old, watching her baby brother take his last breath. His belly was swollen from hunger, his lips cracked and bleeding. Around them, the storage pits that should have sustained the River Clan through winter held nothing but rotting mush, where their carefully gathered tubers had turned black and useless. The winter of the endless snow, as they called it, had already killed half the clan. Kira's grandmother, the keeper of all the old preservation wisdom passed down through countless generations, had died 2 moons earlier, and now the old ways, the traditional methods everyone trusted, were failing catastrophically. Now we need to talk about what preservation meant back then. These weren't people casually storing leftovers. Food preservation was literally the difference between life and death. The River Clan's method had remained unchanged for as long as anyone could remember. You wrapped roots in dried grasses, buried them in shallow pits, maybe covered them with stones to keep animals out. On a good year, you might get 2 moons of storage before decay set in. But this winter was not a good year. This winter, everything was going wrong. The hunters returned empty-handed more often than not. The fish had vanished from the ice-covered river, and those storage pits, the ones they'd counted on, betrayed them one by one. Kira was not someone who accepted defeat easily. Grief-stricken and desperate, she did something nobody in the River Clan would dare to do. She went into the forbidden caves. These weren't just any caves. These were the places where, according to every story told around every fire, angry spirits dwelled. The elders spoke of clan members who had ventured inside and never returned. Strange sounds echoed from the depths. Water dripped in rhythms that sounded almost like voices. The very stone formations seemed to reach toward you with grasping fingers. Children were taught to fear these caves from the moment they could walk, but Kira had watched her brother die. Fear suddenly seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. She followed a wounded deer into the darkness. The animal, struck by one of the clan's hunters but not killed, had fled into the cave mouth, trailing blood on the snow. Kira grabbed a torch and went after it, thinking only of the meat her people desperately needed. The limestone passages twisted and turned, going deeper than she imagined possible. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and those strange formations rose from floor and ceiling like the teeth of some massive beast. Her torch cast wild shadows that made everything seem alive and threatening. Then she found it. Deep within the mountain, where the temperature never changed and moisture hung thick in the air, Kira discovered storage pits that shouldn't have existed. They were ancient, clearly made by human hands, lined with a thick grey clay that felt smooth and cool to the touch. And inside those pits were roots that should have rotted away generations ago. Roots that remained firm and edible and perfect. Kira knelt beside those ancient pits, running her hands over the clay lining. She understood immediately. The clay formed an impenetrable seal. It kept moisture constant while somehow preventing the rot that destroyed normal storage. The temperature here never fluctuated like it did outside. This cave, this forbidden place, was the perfect natural storage chamber. And someone, long ago, had known it. When she returned to the clan carrying those perfectly preserved roots, you might think everyone would celebrate. You would be wrong. Gorak, the eldest shaman, a man who had guided the River Clan for 30 winters, declared the caves cursed. He forbade anyone from using what he called the unholy preservation method. The spirits would bring vengeance on them all, he warned. The ancestors would turn away from a clan that violated sacred taboos. Kira's discovery, in his eyes, was not salvation but damnation. The clan fractured. Some sided with Gorak, trusting in tradition and fearing spiritual consequences. But others, especially the young hunters led by a man named Tam, had seen too many children die. They had buried too many mothers and fathers and siblings. They were done watching people starve while perfectly good food rotted in inadequate storage. These young warriors quietly supported Kira as she began her experiments. She worked in secret at first, preparing test pits away from the main camp. She studied that cave clay obsessively, trying to understand its properties. It wasn't just any clay. She discovered it was river clay, mixed with crushed limestone, the same limestone that formed the cave itself. The ratio mattered. Too much limestone and the mixture cracked. Too little and it remained permeable. She tested different proportions, different application methods, different pit depths. Her hands were perpetually stained grey with clay, her fingernails broken and rough. The great trial came during the moon of first flowers, when winter finally released its grip. Kira challenged Gorak directly before the entire assembled clan. 2 sets of storage pits, prepared at the same time 4 moons earlier. One set used the traditional method, wrapped in dried grasses and stored in shallow pits. The other used Kira's clay-lined technique, with river clay mixed with crushed limestone in the precise proportions she had perfected, applied 3 fingers thick to pits, dug 3 arm lengths deep. The moment of revelation came on a spring morning with the whole clan gathered in a circle. Gorak himself unearthed the traditional stores. The rot was extensive. Fully half the roots had turned to black mush. The remainder were soft, spotted, barely edible. Then Kira opened her clay-sealed pits. The roots emerged firm, fresh, completely preserved. After 4 full moons underground, twice the usual preservation time, they looked as if they had been harvested yesterday. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Tam began to cheer. Other young hunters joined him. Within moments, half the clan was celebrating while the other half stood in shocked silence. Gorak's face went through several expressions before settling on something between anger and grudging acceptance. The old ways had failed, the forbidden method had succeeded, and everything was about to change. Kira stood there with clay-stained hands and exhausted eyes, holding a perfectly preserved root. She had no idea that her desperate experiment in a forbidden cave would spread across continents. She couldn't know that her clay mixture would be copied and adapted by cultures from the Yellow River to the Nile. She was just trying to keep her people from starving. Sometimes that is how history gets made. Now we need to talk about what happens when a truly revolutionary idea starts to spread. Because Kira's discovery did not quietly diffuse across the landscape, it exploded, and like most explosions, it caused a lot of destruction along the way. Word travelled fast between 15,000 and 12,000 years before Christ. You might think these scattered clans lived in isolation, but they were connected through an intricate network of traders, wandering storytellers, and seasonal gathering sites where multiple groups came together to exchange goods and information. When traders from the River Clan arrived at these gatherings with perfectly preserved roots after 6 moons of storage, people noticed. When they casually mentioned that their clan had not lost a single person to starvation all winter, everyone wanted to know the secret. The mountain clans reacted first, and their reaction was not what you would call positive. Led by a fierce chieftain named Borak, a man who had personally killed 3 cave bears and wore their claws around his neck, these highland warriors viewed Kira's method with absolute contempt. Real warriors, Borak proclaimed, did not need to hide food in clay like cowards. Real strength meant taking what you needed through hunting prowess and raiding courage. Preservation was for the weak, for people who lacked the spine to face winter like their ancestors had. His warriors echoed these sentiments loudly and often, mocking the River Clan and anyone who adopted their methods. Pride, as it turns out, is a luxury only the well-fed can afford. The Winter of White Death arrived 2 years after Kira's discovery. Even the mountain clans, who lived at elevations where they thought they understood harsh winters, were unprepared for this one. Snow fell for 40 consecutive days. Game animals vanished completely, either dead or fled to unknown refuges. The ice was too thick to fish through, and those traditional storage methods that Borak had defended so vehemently failed catastrophically. By the time the Moon of Long Darkness ended, the mountain clans had lost more than half their people. Children died first, then the elderly, then even strong warriors, weakened by relentless hunger. Borak himself, proud Borak with his bear claw necklace and his speeches about warrior strength, came down from the mountains in early spring. He came to the River Clan, to Kira specifically, and he begged. Not for himself, he said, but for the children who remained, the handful of survivors who needed food immediately or they would join the dead. It was, by all accounts, the most humiliating moment of his life. But Kira did not gloat. She fed them, and then she taught them. This moment changed everything. If even the mighty Borak had to admit the value of clay preservation, then clearly this was not some passing fad. This was survival technology that worked. Within 2 years, the demand for preservation knowledge became so intense that it led to what history would remember as the challenge of the 7 tribes. 7 clan leaders agreed to a survival test. The idea was simple but brutal. Each clan would prepare for winter using their preferred preservation method. No trading, no sharing, no outside help. When spring arrived, they would gather to see who had fared best. It was part competition, part demonstration, and part desperate attempt to settle the question once and for all. Kira, now recognized as a master preserver across the entire region, personally trained 3 of the 7 clans. She spent weeks with each group, teaching them everything she had learned. The precise mixture ratios, 2 parts river clay to 1 part crushed limestone, mixed with just enough water to reach the consistency of thick porridge. The importance of pit depth, at least 3 arm lengths down, where temperature stayed constant and frost could not penetrate. The critical timing of harvest and storage, which had to happen during the dry moon phase when roots contained the least moisture and were least likely to rot. The competing clans used their own traditional methods. One relied on smoke drying, hanging roots over fires until they shriveled into hard, bitter lumps that could last but tasted terrible. Another used salt preservation, trading precious furs and ivory to coastal peoples for bags of white crystals that could preserve food but required enormous quantities. A third used ice caves high in the mountains, natural freezers that worked brilliantly until a warm spell hit midwinter and everything thawed and refroze into an unusable mess. The remaining clan used the old method, dried grasses and shallow pits, hoping that tradition would somehow prove sufficient. When spring arrived and the 7 clans gathered for the reckoning, the results were undeniable. The 3 clay preservation clans had lost almost no one. Their food stores remained abundant, their people healthy and strong. The smoke-drying clan had survived but suffered terribly, their people gaunt and weakened by months of eating bitter, nutrition-depleted food. The salt preservation clan had fared slightly better, but had exhausted their trade goods and faced years of poverty to rebuild their wealth. The Ice Cave clan had lost 1/3 of their people when the warm spell destroyed their stores, and the traditional method clan had nearly been wiped out entirely. You would think this clear demonstration would end the debate. Instead, it triggered the first storage wars. Desperate clans, the ones who had rejected the new methods and now faced extinction, began raiding storage sites. If they could not create abundance, they would steal it. These raids were vicious. Entire storage complexes were destroyed, their clay linings smashed, their contents scattered or taken. People died defending food pits. The careful work of months could be destroyed in a single night by raiders who cared nothing for preservation knowledge, only for immediate survival. This led to the formation of the Root Keepers, elite warriors whose sole purpose was guarding storage sites. These were not ordinary fighters. They had to be absolutely trustworthy, willing to stay awake through cold nights, alert for any sound of approaching raiders. They developed a whole culture around their role, special songs and rituals, distinctive tattoos made from the same clay they protected. The most honored root keepers were said to sleep with one eye open and could distinguish between the footfall of a deer and the footfall of a human raider. The worst moment came when Mara betrayed everyone. Mara had been Kira's own apprentice, a talented young woman who had learned every secret of the clay mixture, every subtle technique that made the difference between good preservation and perfect preservation. Her husband had been captured by the Storm Valley Raiders, brutal fighters from the north who had rejected all new methods. They held him hostage, promising his release if Mara would trade the secret recipe. She agreed. The resulting conflict nearly destroyed everything Kira had built. The Storm Valley Raiders, armed with preservation knowledge, became even more dangerous. They could now sustain longer raids, strike deeper into enemy territory, survive winters that would have previously forced them to retreat. It took a coalition of 7 clans, fighting together under Kira's leadership, to finally drive them back. The battle at Split Rock Pass became legendary. Route keepers held a narrow defile for 3 days against overwhelming numbers, protecting the storage complexes behind them. 24 warriors died, but the storage sites survived. Mara, for what it is worth, got her husband back. The raiders kept their word on that count, but she was exiled from every clan that practiced clay preservation. She wandered for years, neither fully accepted by the traditional peoples nor forgiven by the innovators. Some say she eventually found peace in a distant valley. Others say she died alone and unmourned. Either way, her name became synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. But something interesting happened through all this conflict. The knowledge spread anyway. It spread through strategic marriages. Families with preservation expertise became extraordinarily valuable. A young woman trained in Kira's methods could command a bride price of 30 wolf pelts and ivory beads, wealth that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Preservation masters gained status equal to hunt leaders and shamans, taking seats at councils where decisions about the clan's future were made. The wars, brutal as they were, proved one thing beyond doubt. You could not stop this knowledge from spreading. It was too valuable, too necessary, too obviously superior to every alternative. Clans could fight over it, die for it, betray each other trying to control it. But in the end, anyone who wanted to survive had to learn it. So here's where the story gets really interesting. Between 12,000 and 8,000 years before Christ, something remarkable happened. Kira's preservation method did not just help people survive. It transformed the entire structure of human society. We are talking about a fundamental shift in how people lived, where they lived, and what they could accomplish together. The great storage temples emerged first along the river valleys of what would one day become the Danube Basin. These were not simple pits dug into the ground. These were massive underground complexes, carved from solid rock over years of sustained effort, lined with carefully prepared clay applied in layers 3 fingers thick. A single temple could preserve enough food to sustain 1,000 people through the harshest winter imaginable. Think about what that means. 1,000 people, living together, through winter, without fear of starvation. Before Kira's discovery, human bands rarely exceeded 50 or 60 people. That was the maximum number you could keep fed through hunting and gathering, especially during lean seasons. But now, with reliable food storage, the math changed completely. You could support larger populations. You could have specialists, people who did not hunt or gather, but instead focused entirely on preservation, or tool-making, or teaching children, or creating art. The temples became the beating heart of these new mega-communities, and settlements grew up around them like flowers around a water source. Each temple followed Kira's essential principles, but regional innovations started appearing. The forest clans, living among the great birch and pine forests to the north, discovered something fascinating. If you placed layers of birch bark between the clay layers, preservation time increased dramatically. The bark somehow helped regulate moisture even more precisely than clay alone. Roots stored this way could last 8 or 9 moons instead of 6. The lake peoples, living along the shores of vast freshwater bodies, found that adding crushed shells to their clay mixture prevented rodent intrusion. Mice and voles, persistent thieves that could destroy entire storage pits, could not chew through shell-reinforced clay. This is how human knowledge grows, isn't it? Someone makes a breakthrough, and then hundreds of people start tinkering with it, improving it, adapting it to local conditions. Within a few generations, there were dozens of variations on Kira's basic method, each one optimized for different climates, different types of food, different available materials. But someone had to spread this knowledge. Someone had to carry it from valley to valley, across mountains and rivers, to people who had never heard of clay preservation. This is where the knowledge bearers come into the story. Kira herself founded this sacred order in her 40th year. She was older now, respected across a vast territory, but she worried constantly about what would happen when she died. How would the knowledge survive? How would it reach isolated clans who lived beyond the trade networks? She gathered 30 of her most dedicated students, both men and women, and trained them not just in preservation techniques, but in the art of teaching itself. How to demonstrate the clay mixture. How to explain the principles so people understood why it worked, not just how to do it. How to adapt the method to whatever materials were locally available. These knowledge bearers memorized the preservation songs, rhythmic verses that encoded precise instructions. You might think writing would be better, but these people had no writing system. Instead, they developed something arguably more reliable: poetry and music that could be memorized perfectly and passed along unchanged. The songs described everything: the consistency of clay through comparisons to familiar textures, the required pit depth measured in body lengths, the seasonal timing linked to plant growth stages and moon phases that anyone could observe. The knowledge bearers undertook journeys that were genuinely heroic. They crossed frozen rivers in winter, gambling that the ice would hold. They scaled mountain passes, where one wrong step meant falling to your death. They travelled through territories controlled by hostile tribes who viewed strangers with suspicion or outright violence. Each bearer carried small clay vessels containing the perfect mixture, ready to demonstrate on arrival. Many died on these journeys. Saber-toothed cats killed some. Cave bears killed others. Still others simply vanished, lost to accidents or illness or violence, their knowledge dying with them. But enough survived to spread preservation wisdom across an entire continent. The social structure of clans transformed completely around preservation capabilities. Storage queens emerged as powerful leaders who controlled food distribution. This was genuinely new in human society. Before reliable storage, leadership typically went to the best hunters or the most charismatic warriors. But now, the person who controlled the food stores controlled everything. The greatest of these storage queens was a woman named Sula of the Eastern Rivers, who united 12 separate clans under her rule through a simple but brilliant strategy. Sula guaranteed food security. She built a network of interconnected storage sites, each one supporting the others. If one region had a bad harvest, surplus from other regions would compensate. If raiders struck one storage temple, the others would share their abundance. This mutual insurance system created loyalty that no warrior chief could match through force alone. People followed Sula not because they feared her, but because they trusted her to keep them fed. That is real power. Religious ceremonies evolved to honor what people called the Earth Mother, the force that provided both clay and crops. These were not abstract theological exercises. These were practical celebrations deeply tied to survival. The Feast of First Opening, when preserved foods were ceremonially unearthed after winter, became the most important celebration in the entire calendar. Imagine the relief, the joy, of opening those clay-sealed pits and finding the food still perfect after months underground. Every single time it worked felt like a miracle, even though people understood the technique. The dances that developed around these ceremonies mimicked the preservation process itself. Dancers would crouch low, miming the digging of pits. They would shape invisible clay with careful hand movements. They would gently place imaginary roots into storage, then cover them, then dig them up again in spring with exaggerated expressions of delight. These dances taught children the preservation sequence while celebrating the abundance it created. Villages grew larger and more permanent. When you can reliably store food, you do not need to follow migrating herds. You can stay in one place, build more substantial structures, invest in improvements that take years to complete. The great storage temples became centers not just of preservation but of culture, learning, and community identity. Artists decorated their walls with paintings showing the preservation process, the changing seasons, the animals and plants that sustained life. These were the first permanent art galleries, and their subject was survival itself. This was the golden age, the the time when Kira's desperate experiment in a forbidden cave blossomed into a complete transformation of human existence. People looked back at the old nomadic life, the constant hunger, the winter die-offs, and they could barely believe their ancestors had lived that way. The new abundance seemed so natural, so obviously right, that it was hard to imagine life without it. But nothing lasts forever. And the next chapter of this story would test everything they had built. The catastrophic floods came in 8,000 years before Christ. Nobody alive had seen anything like them. Nobody even had stories about floods of this magnitude. What happened was this. Massive glacial lakes, held back by ice dams for thousands of years, suddenly burst. The ice gave way all at once, releasing volumes of water that are almost impossible to comprehend. Entire landscapes were reshaped in days. Valleys that had sustained communities for generations became raging torrents. The great storage temples, those magnificent underground complexes that had fed thousands, flooded and collapsed. Kira was 73 years old when the waters came. She had lived long enough to see her discovery spread across a continent, long enough to watch scattered bands transform into thriving settlements, long enough to be called the grandmother of preservation by people who lived hundreds of miles from her home valley, and now she was watching it all wash away. But here is what separates truly great minds from merely clever ones. Kira did not despair. She adapted. If the storage temples could be destroyed by natural disasters, then the knowledge itself needed to be preserved in a form that could survive anything. The oral traditions, the preservation songs, the careful teaching from master to apprentice, all of that was valuable. But it was also vulnerable. One plague, one war, one catastrophic event could wipe out an entire generation of knowledge bearers and the wisdom they carried. Kira needed something permanent, something that would outlast human memory. She needed to carve the knowledge into stone itself. She gathered the last council of root keepers at the sacred cave, the very place where she had made her original discovery more than 50 years earlier. These were not young warriors anymore. These were old men and women, scarred by decades of defending storage sites, grey-haired but still fierce, in their dedication to preservation knowledge. Kira stood before them, her own hair white as snow, her hands gnarled from arthritis but still capable, and she told them her plan. They would carve the complete preservation instructions onto the cave walls. Not simple pictures, not decorative art. Comprehensive, detailed, step-by-step instructions that anyone could follow, even if they had never heard of clay preservation before. The carvings would show everything, the proper consistency of clay depicted through wavy lines that mimicked the texture, the required pit depth shown by human figures for scale, so you could see exactly how deep to dig relative to a person's height. The seasonal timing indicated by moon phases and plant growth stages that could be observed anywhere. Master carvers spent 3 years on this project, 3 years of careful, painstaking work, chipping away at limestone with stone tools and bone chisels. They worked by torchlight in the cool depths of the cave, creating what amounted to the world's first illustrated instruction manual. Every step of the preservation process was depicted in sequence, following the natural flow of the cave walls. A person could walk through the cave and learn the entire method just by following the carvings. But Kira insisted on more than just one cave. She understood redundancy in a way that was remarkably modern. What if something happened to the sacred cave? What if it collapsed, or flooded, or was destroyed by future disasters? The knowledge could not depend on a single location. She demanded that the same information be carved in 12 different caves across the entire region, each one carefully selected for geological stability and protected locations. This decision required an enormous commitment. 12 caves meant 12 teams of master carvers, years of coordinated effort, massive resources devoted to what was essentially an insurance policy. Some council members questioned the expense. Surely 1 or 2 copies would be sufficient. But Kira was adamant. She had seen too much lost to floods and fire and human conflict. 12 caves or nothing. Despite her advanced age, Kira personally visited each carving site. She travelled by foot, by canoe, and on stretchers carried by devoted followers when her legs finally gave out. At each cave, she inspected the work, checking for accuracy, adding corrections where needed. And at each cave, she performed the same ritual. She dipped her hand in red ochre, that ancient pigment that humans had used for decoration since time immemorial, and she pressed her palm against the stone beside the carvings. Her handprint, her personal mark of approval, appeared in 12 caves scattered across the landscape. Those handprints said, "I was here. I verified this. This knowledge is true." The great dispersal that followed the floods carried preservation knowledge to every corner of the inhabited world. Refugees fled the flooded valleys, carrying whatever they could save. Many carried clay-lined storage vessels, those portable containers that embodied the principles Kira had discovered. More importantly, they carried the knowledge itself, embedded in their minds through years of practice. These refugees became teachers in their new homes, spreading preservation wisdom to peoples who had never encountered it. Within centuries, variations of Kira's method appeared everywhere. In the Yellow River Valley, people adapted the technique using local yellow clay and bamboo reinforcement. Along the Nile Delta, they modified it for the unique flood patterns of that great river, timing their storage to work with rather than against the annual inundations. In the Indus region, they developed ceramic storage vessels that applied the same principles of sealed, controlled environments. The core insight, that fundamental understanding of how to prevent decay through careful control of moisture and temperature, spread like seeds on the wind. This transition from nomadic to settled life, enabled by reliable food storage, laid the foundation for everything that came after. Agriculture itself depended on the ability to store surplus. Why cultivate crops if you cannot preserve the harvest? Why settle in one place if you cannot maintain food supplies through lean seasons? The great civilizations that would rise in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Indus Valley all rested on this foundation. The ability to store food reliably and safely. Modern archaeologists studying the Kira caves, as they are now called, have confirmed what oral traditions maintained for thousands of years. A single innovation in food preservation genuinely changed the trajectory of human history. The clay-lined storage pits they have discovered, some still containing preserved organic material after 13,000 years, validate every aspect of the ancient techniques. Carbon dating, chemical analysis, and archaeological reconstruction all tell the same story. This was real. This worked. This mattered. Today, when you walk into a root cellar, you are using technology that traces back to Kira. When you ferment vegetables, you are applying principles she understood. Even modern controlled atmosphere storage, with all its sophisticated technology and computer monitoring, is fundamentally doing what she figured out in that forbidden cave, controlling moisture and temperature to prevent decay. We live in a world of abundance that Kira could barely have imagined. Grocery stores overflow with food preserved through dozens of different methods. We can eat strawberries in winter and store meat for years. Famine, at least in developed nations, has become largely a matter of distribution rather than absolute scarcity. But it all traces back to one young woman, driven by grief and desperation, who dared to enter a place everyone else feared. She was not trying to change the world. She was trying to keep her people from starving. Sometimes, that is exactly how history gets made. One person, one moment, one desperate gamble that pays off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Kira died at 76 years old, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in a settlement that bore her name. She lived long enough to see the carvings completed, long enough to know that her knowledge would survive even if civilization itself collapsed. Her last words, according to tradition, were simple: "Remember the clay." They did. We still do. And we always will.